And so what we've had is transgenderism is a government-sponsored religion. And I wrote an article on that for public discourse that anybody can access. And a California attorney locked onto that and wrote her own and sent me a thank you on that for getting her started on it. And this is what it is, imposed ideology.
What the church was not prepared for or aware of is how those that are pushing a change of belief system and theology within the church, within the Orthodox Church, are coming into the church and simply saying things like, oh, but there's so many varied beliefs around these topics of LGBTQ within the church, and different theologians feel differently and think differently about that. And so we just want to simply be, come in and really be neutral on this. We're not taking a strong position either way on this. And what that does, that's an entry point in. That's the proverbial, the camel getting its nose under the tent kind of thing.
There's a better way to live. Again, we're talking behavior, not the person. So we don't want people thinking, you're just bashing gays. You didn't hear anything we said. We're talking behavior, and we don't believe the ideology that you are gay, straight, cis, trans.
As Christians, we need to be able to learn how to separate ideology from individuals. And we don't do that well. I think many people in the LGBT community assume that the church hates them because they've been told over and over again. As Christians, if we are recognizing like this, the horrendous stuff that's being dumped on children, the things that you and I have talked about, the things that you've unpacked and explained, we need to actually not just stick our heads in the sand, but we need to rise up and be part of the solution in love and graciousness, but with clarity and firmness as well. Well, hey, friends, thank you so much. Whether you're joining us from Transforming Congregations or through Love and Truth Network, those websites, we are so happy that you're here. We're happy that you have tuned in for another episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast. And I want to introduce you to a friend of mine, to really somebody who is leading the way in exposing truth and bringing truth to bear in a lot of confusion that's going on in our world, that's going on in our culture, obviously, particularly around the trans topic, but certainly in a broader way in the LGBT world, and really calling Christians to examine what's true, to understand what's true, to be critical thinkers in the best sense of the term, to not just accept everything that we're told, to not believe the headlines necessarily, or look at every outcome of a study that we're told, to how to believe and how to think about those things. So I'm excited to have Andre Van Mol here with us, Dr. Van Mol, and to have him weigh in on some of the topics that we want to discuss today. So to our audience, thank you for being here. And Dr. Van Mol, thank you so much for being here as well.
Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. Well, hey, when we have a guest on, where we usually begin is their experience with Jesus. Like, what was life like before coming to Christ? A little bit of background there. How did you come to faith in Christ? And then how has life been different since then for you?
Well, we came to the United States as a poor immigrant family when I was about a year and a half old.
Okay.
$300 in the car, and the only English speaker was my 11-year-old sister. And ended up here in Redding, California when I was about, two and a half. Strong Christian family. Our particular case, the family history is coming out of Belgium. My mom by way of Italy. We're kind of, nominal Catholics. The Assemblies of God came through town, and most everybody converted. And my father, when he wasn't a welder and mechanic, was a pastor, and that's what brought us to Montreal, where I was born. But boom, here we are in Redding, California. Grew up in a strong Christian family, had stuff, demonstrated to me. As we say about educating kids, more is caught than taught. So I could follow what my parents were doing, not just, what they were saying. I remember my first, conversion experience was at church when there was somebody from the Billy Graham Crusade, and I was 7 years old, and I was telling Dad, hey, I want to go up. Typical insecure church kid, you recommit your life to the Lord about 1,000 times, because every time you screw up, you figure, oh no, I'm not a real one.
Right.
But when I was 14, I still remember it. I'm 63 now, but this was 1974, December 29. And I don't even remember what the sermon was about. I just remember the Lord and I were having this encounter, this exchange. And it's like, hey, my childhood faith has become kind of childish, and I need to make a decision. So what's it going to be? So, recommitted my life to the Lord, and boom, just felt that the joy and all the good stuff Scriptures, talks about. And that really set me off. From that point, I view that as my mature conversion. I guess probably it's not theologically safe to say, well, there was nothing wrong with your 7-year-old conversion. The Lord listens to kids too. Right. You don't get a junior Holy Spirit when you're a kid. You get the real deal. Yep. Excuse me. But there it was. And as a teenager, there was a real fire in my gut for apologetics and what I later, know was called bioethics, culture of life kind of stuff.
Yes.
And that just built with time. And I was kind of known for, standing up, for the faith and bioethics in high school, college, med school, et cetera, right on through. But of course, as, the years go by, you get exposed to more and better information, or for that matter, more and worse, that there's something wrong with this. And so started kind of studying individual, things in bioethics, of course, rights of conscience, assisted suicide, abortion, and, why those are actually not good things and how to come against them. But more broadly, the sexual dynamic. Initially, studying material on, same-sex attraction. I thought the trans thing, of everything in bioethics, this is surely something I can skip. Everyone's going to get this. They're going to see through it. And fall of 2017, I was sitting exactly where I am now talking to you. And it was this situation where you kind of feel almost like a hand on your left shoulder, nothing physical, but I thought God just kind of spoke to me saying, you're wrong, make a lecture. And it's meaningful for me because that's how I condense my thoughts, is around lectures, and then I build out from them once I have them. And then within months, I was in Sacramento working with teams testifying against these kind of bills, speaking to legislators, trying to lobby, with their staff, and whatnot. And that would lead to other things, and being on some national task forces and stuff like that. I co-chair the committee on, or the Council on Adolescent Sexuality, the Council on Adolescent Sexuality for the American College of Pediatricians. I co-chair the task force on gender and sexual identity for the Christian Medical and Dental Association. And I'm really involved with Alliance Defending Freedom and their efforts. So our team there will be like helping them with amicus briefs that are submitted to Circuit Court and Supreme Court, to explain a position or to counter, other evidence and stuff. And, getting to, testify in legislatures or parliaments, in different countries. I mean, there's a limited amount of travel I can do. I mean, I'm a family doctor full time. I mean, that's how I make the bread that goes on the table, Okay, yeah. So everything else is coming out of my side time. And I also don't want to, impose on my marriage time or my family time either. Still have, a bunch of kids in the house. So I'm kind of selective about stuff. And if I can backtrack, it's like, well, that still didn't explain maybe so much of how the sexual ethic got into it. Well, as a teenager, where I went to church, again, way up here in northernmost California, we were introduced to this missionary to the gay community in San Francisco. And even in the late 70s, they were seeing 36 people a week come to the Lord. And of course, then, the answer was, okay, welcome to the family of God, get out of this town. 1 and 2. There's more stuff available for people now, resources and things like that. So the answer isn't necessarily, you're an alcoholic working in a whiskey factory, get a new job. it was more, get in with the family of God, work from the inside out, work from the Lord. There's all these resources. There's things you can do. You're not, maybe it's not fair to ever say it was white knuckling it. I think that's probably grossly unfair. People are better informed now. People can help more than platitudes.
Right.
So.
Yep. Yeah. Well, there's definitely a season of my life where, where I was kind of white knuckling it for a while in terms of a variety of areas that were addictive or compulsive. And I do think that for many of us, that's kind of a process or a stage that we do need to go through. I mean, essentially where we're saying no to something and yet not fully aware in many ways by a long shot on how to, activate holiness, or how to walk with God in a way, how to break free of not just from the behavior, which we can make a choice about, obviously, but those deeper drivers that tend to wear us down over time if we're not finding answers or solutions to those things. So I think that part of what as I'm listening to you, part of what I hear you saying is that, there's so much more that we know now and also the reality that we are approaching this, I think now, and have been for the last, I don't know, maybe a couple of decades, certainly the last decade for sure, from more of a holistic perspective, that it's definitely a spiritual issue, to be sure, but it's we're spirit, soul, and body, that it is so much more than simply a spiritual issue.
Right.
And so we have to it's helpful to understand underlying causes and some of the root issues that developed, so that we can invite Christ into some of those places, so that we can have our understanding changed and to reframe perspectives that we have that have felt like, bedrock realities, when in fact, no, those things really are not rooted. They're rooted more in trauma or brokenness or those kinds of things. So when I hear you sharing what you just did, that's what I think of, is that we've really grown, I think, in the capacity to do that. In some cases, I think there's what I'd say is we tend to overshoot something. When we are correcting something, we can tend to overshoot and lean too much. Then I think, like on therapy, for example, I think that my wife is a licensed Christian counselor, and I know many others who are as well. And I'm so grateful that we have good mental health counselors. But I think sometimes now there's such a tendency to move so quickly toward counseling, almost to the point that we're not even walking with people in the church. It's more of, let me refer you to a counselor. And the truth is, many times we need both. We always need the relationship connection within the church, and then sometimes we need a really qualified counselor to walk with us through past issues of trauma, abuse, neglect, rejection, whatever. But sometimes I think we in the church tend to simply refer, rather than, no, we're going to we want to walk with you in this place, even as you're working these things out in the counseling office. Does that make sense?
Some things that come to mind is, look at the ancients, the book of Ecclesiastes. There's nothing new under the sun.
Right.
Look at the New Testament answer to that. No temptation has overtaken you but that which is common to people. And with it, the Lord provides a way to escape. The problem we have right now is, of course, temptation is being canonized, as one author said. It's like, it's not that big. Oh, yeah, it is. It's who I am. No, it's just how you are,
Right.
But if you're going to canonize it, it's going to be kind of hard to deal with, give your temptation this sacred place in your life. And it's like, I don't see why your temptation's any holier than mine.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Well, I think also, as you say that, and you mentioned the word canonize, that really brings up, for me, I've had more of an epiphany through others that have shared this, and have really come to a place of believing that much within the LGBT, framework, ideology is not just a, it's being posed as simply, this is who you are, this is your identity, this is immutable, these are immutable characteristics like eye color, skin color, whatever else that would be true of us bodily. But what I've come to realize is there's so much behind this that is really it's a religious framework. I mean, it is a new religion, and it definitely competes with the truths of Scripture and competes with Christ and how he he revealed himself to us. And honestly, in many ways, it competes directly against Christ's call that if you're going to be my disciple, you need to deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me. I mean, that is anathema to the ideology of LGBTQ, and of course the ideology of self, basically within the heterosexual population too, right? So there is something of a strong religious component. And when you mention the word canonized, that's what comes to my mind.
Yeah, and it's a dodge. Ultimately, it's like, no, there is no issue. And of course, think of the subject of the language is weaponized, right?
Yeah.
And if there's anything that side's good at in the entire secular progressive thing is weaponizing language. So when we come on the playing field and we're using their terms, we're already painted into a corner and on very thin ice.
Right.
So kind of the intro I give is, these are category errors, gay, straight, cis, trans, category errors in weaponized terms. For all of human history, sexuality was a verb, not a noun. It's something you did, not who you were. Behavior, but it's not identity. Then in the 1800s in Europe, this homosexual, heterosexual thing was invented, purely ideological, by the way. And then in the mid-20th century, the gay, straight, changing of the language, equally ideological, but it has its due effect. It gets people thinking a certain way,
Yes.
And it's not it, So what's our answer to that would be, if your ideology, says you're gay or straight or whatever, what I'm going with says, no, you're a man or a woman created in the image of God, of tremendous value. That is the exclusive source of such things as universal human rights, universal human equality. And we have that little factoid, from Jürgen Habermas, Europe's preeminent philosopher who's an atheist, Luc Ferré, his French equivalent, and, right on down the line, these high scholars that understand the Judeo-Christian faith's contribution to the Western world. So when people come against us and say, well, you're against gay rights, you're against human rights, it's like, you can't have that. You didn't earn that. Human rights come from the Judeo-Christian framework. So a less Christian America is not going to be a less religious one, but you sure won't like the faith that takes its place once you've taken all this foundational stuff out of the way,
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me as
absolutely.
I preach. But.
No, that's great. It reminds me also of a conversation I was recently involved in another country, from people in another country, talking about how there was this, what the church was not prepared for or aware of is how those that are pushing a change of belief system and theology within the church, within the Orthodox Church, are coming into the church and simply saying things like, oh, but there's so many varied beliefs around these topics of LGBTQ within the church, and different theologians feel differently and think differently about that. And so we just want to simply be, come in and really be neutral on this. We're not taking a strong position either way on this. And what that does, I hadn't really thought about it before this conversation, but what that does, that's an entry point in. That's the proverbial, the camel getting its nose under the tent kind of thing, is that now there's this in our desire to be merciful and kind and just invite others to the table. We're really inviting very, very divergent from Scripture views on sexuality for sure, and we're doing it because it's like, oh well, you're not pushing the idea yet. You're not pushing the idea of we need to adopt pro-gay theology, but you are being more nuanced and neutral about that. Honestly, I get so sick of the word nuance these days. Right. I just hear so many Christian leaders using that word, and and I understand that it can be a good word and can be used well, but it's overused. And what I'm finding more and more is that leaders are using that as a way of kind of abdicating clarity of truth, clarity in general.
It's another dodge.
It is another dodge in many ways. And I'm not saying that the word can't be used appropriately, but it tends to be a dodge from having to say the difficult things, the hard things, but the things that actually produce life. That's what we're for, right? We actually desire transformation by the power of the Holy Spirit, not simply a tweak on our flesh, and then call that's really a false gospel,
right.
because there's no life change that's happened there. We simply are speaking, we're using, like you're saying, we're using, even the word gospel means very different things to different people these days. We can't assume that when someone uses the word gospel, they're talking about this surrender of ourselves and this death to self to embrace the life that Jesus died to give us. Instead, it can mean, something that's not at all biblical gospel. Yeah. So it's important that we, I think, step back and look at language, even the word love. I mean, talk about being, twisted out of proportion. Yeah. When you look at what 1 Corinthians 13 verse 6 says, is that we know that whole chapter is being, the love chapter essentially. And it is such an important piece of scripture. But verse 6 says, love does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. And if you were to use that as a benchmark or a barometer for where we're at in the Christian church, in many cases, we are way off base of that. We are actually moving so much closer to where culture is at, rather than standing firm on the scriptures and acting out of genuine love and inviting people out of darkness into the light of the truth as
my wife
salvation.
Likes to say, what's loving about telling someone they cannot change? Or, Professor Robert Gagnon there at Houston Christian University, he points out, as you were, that genuine love has a corrective function. And I would add, without that corrective function, it's just enablement and codependency. So, so it's just loving to so-and-so. It's like, that's actually not love at all. You're throwing someone under the bus. Right. And, as you were mentioning before, we can't, you don't want to overemphasize it. You don't skip it either. It's one sin among many. Although the effects of it are, not the effects of all sin are not all equal. Things work differently, right? Cheating on your taxes is different than murdering a child. The consequences are different. And we genuinely believe, as Christians, that any sex that's not between husband and wife is generally against human flourishing. It's not helpful. And that there's a better way to live. Again, we're talking behavior, not the person. So we don't want people thinking, you're just bashing gays. You didn't hear anything we said. Right. We're talking behavior, and we don't believe the ideology that you are gay, straight, cis, trans.
Yes, or unable, as somebody who is totally opposite sex attracted. You're also not unable to live a life that is sanctified and actually blesses the other, as opposed to using the other and even allowing ourselves to be used and objectified. There's so much more that God has for us than that. I mean, really, the development and the thriving of the whole person. And when we are living in sexual immorality and we're doing these quick fixes, these microwave options to feel better, to stuff down our pain, to fill the emptiness, to whatever the thing we're trying to do to self-medicate, so often sex becomes a part of that. So often in our day now, with the rapid increase of acceptance and celebration around transgenderism, and of course transgenderism now is that whole label has blown up in terms of what's underneath of it. And when I say blown up, I simply mean it's expanded, and it now encompasses so many different things, even in the area of furries, even in the area of not just transgender, but trans species even. So, when you look at all of that, even that is this kind of this quick fix option that I'm going to take control of my own life. I'm going to be the God of my own outcomes. And I now we believe the lie. People believe the lie that in their pain and their sorrow and their suffering, oftentimes as children, with little attachment or no attachment to mom, dad, or maybe one but not the other. And by the way, I think that fatherlessness is one of the biggest areas of crises in not just in the culture, but in the world or in the church as well, many times. And so we're trying to find this identity, and it feels like why wouldn't it be compelling to a young person to be told that, oh, these are some concrete changes you can make. This is what's wrong with you. And you can take steps now to correct all this and solve the pain and the problems in your life. And instead of being told something that is actually good and will promote thriving, will promote genuine life and joy. Instead of that, it's just this downward spiral that's going to lead further and further into sorrow, depression, all kinds of disturbances. And yet we're not recognizing as adults what's happening to the children around us. I mean, I see it in people's lives. I see it in the moms and dads I talk to. I see it in the various people who, the people who have embraced this ideology. And you watch from the beginning of when they started to embrace this, and the more that they delve into it, the further they go down that rabbit hole, right, the more depressed, the more anxious, the more disturbed they get. And yet there's a lack of recognizing that, and this belief that I just have to dial it in deeper. I have to really commit more to this and go to the next, whatever it is, bottom surgery or
the
mastectomy or whatever.
That makes you go from one step to the other, knowing that it's not fixing things, but surely the next step will be better.
Right.
And then that community squashing any dissent because, you don't want to help the anti-trans bigots, So it's quite a trap.
Yep. Yeah, I had the privilege of sharing the stage with several people a weekend or so ago, and just sharing my story and them sharing theirs. And we did a Q&A and just had a time of together and with pastors as well as with a broader audience. And Chloe Cole was one of the people that was there sharing as well. And man, I mean, her story, she's become such a powerful voice in standing against this mutilation of children and all the things that were done to her and the confusion that was brought about and the lack of anyone understanding, people who should have and did, frankly, but people who should have understood and were curious about wanting to help her uncover, like, what are the situations you're facing at school and at home? What has there been trauma in your life? Are there things that we can help you with that will help your mind, your heart, as opposed to automatically putting you on this conveyor belt of transgender all the way to hormone blockers and so-called therapy, hormone replacement with testosterone in her case, and then double mastectomy. So the things that we are doing and allowing and promoting. And other countries, and I speak to this too, I mean, other countries finally seem to be waking up, and yet America seems to be going, just ratcheting down and more committed to the chaos when other countries are actually recognizing, wait a minute, this is not helpful.
That's right. Comprehensive literature reviews out of the UK, 3 out of the UK, 2 out of Sweden, 1 out of Finland, had these countries do complete 180s from being leaders in pro-transition to, for any minor, the focus has to be mental health for they and their families, because we are sure to find issues, both. I mean, that's one of the two, great realities of gender dysphoria is the overwhelming probability of underlying mental health problems, adverse childhood experiences, bad family dynamics, even maybe in the best of homes, and a real disrepresentation of autism spectrum disorder. It's like those are what need to be dealt with. And the other great reality of it is the natural course of gender dysphoria in a minor is desistance by adulthood, conservatively 85% of the time. And we have a truckload of studies demonstrating that. It's not off the top of our head. Very lefty, very secular, Finland, Sweden, England, 180s, based on the science. The French, what do they call it? National Academy of Medicine, of course, Académie Nationale de Médecine Française, had a fabulous press release they did on this last year, pointing out all this stuff and bemoaning the fact that kids can get all kinds of stuff in France that they shouldn't be able to get, or at least not so easily. The guy who's the head of the evidence-based medicine, it has an organizational name that I don't remember at the top of my head, CBAM or something like that, is the acronym in Belgium, who said, looking at the evidentiary support for use of puberty blockers put forward by WPATH, he said we'd put it in the round file. we'd throw it away. And other countries looking at it saying, hey, this is not what we've been told. But America and Canada, but we have so much, more force globally than Canada is in this. We are the prime outliers on this, and we are the ones driving it. And it's, big ideology, meets big money, be that corporate money or philanthropic, or whatever, and there's plenty of it. And they've captured the academic institutions. The school system in America is a prime driver of this for kids. The entertainment industry, media, and corporate America's gone woke. I mean, granted, with some of these Supreme Court decisions saying this DEI thing, no. And there's, by which DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, which is an antonym. It's exactly the opposite.
Right.
But states like North Carolina, Texas, Florida, and some others now said, you know what? No more of this in our university system. It's going to be based on merit, straight up.
Right.
And because of that, some corporations are starting to rethink their DEI departments that are, so coercive. I've been asked in testimony, for get specific, more recently in the state of Kentucky, where I testified by Zoom in two different legislative sessions for a bill that was ultimately passed, though downgraded a bit. How come? I said the same thing, by the way, in person to an Ohio legislative committee. The reason you don't have more doctors and psychologists here testifying is the very real and true concern that they can be losing their jobs, their career, their personal safety, and potentially that of their families. And the state senator in Kentucky who sponsored the bill pointed out the second go around that she couldn't get a single Kentucky MD to testify against it for exactly that reason. She was told that over and over and over again, I'm not going to lose my job over this. So that's a very high level of coercion and manipulation going on for a group that, claims there's, forgive me, but, that they're so persecuted.
Right.
And this whole everything, you're a victim or you're an oppressor, critical race theory, which is, neo-Marxism and in new clothing, it's wrong. That's not how the world divides. And particularly for Christians, the problem's not power structures, or at least, nowhere near the degree it's being talked about. The problem is sin, and that we're equal partakers. That's the great equalizer that way. So of course, talking about sin is going to be misunderstood if you bring that up, in a legislature, and we're talking about other legalities here, and I use exclusively scientific presentation when I'm doing this, and then what the other side does is comes at us with way cheap theology, or like some gay publications in Florida that came after me. It's like, religion masquerading as science. It's like everything we presented was science. Everything was from the literature. You guys are the ones, throwing all these red herrings, at us and stuff. But it's part of the game. So I guess we expect it when we're out in the public field.
Absolutely, it's true. And Dr. Van Mol, you mentioned earlier, but I'd like you to talk about this a little bit more, or just to say it again, because I don't want this to be missed in the podcast. You mentioned the 85% number as a range or a low number, maybe even higher by some of the studies, but that I want people to really understand that children, I'll say it this way, you can correct and clarify, but basically children who are left to children who deal with some level of gender dysphoria or discomfort in their own bodies, which, by the way, can anybody think back to when they were going through puberty and not feeling uncomfortable in our bodies? Yeah. But children that are starting to feel that way, dealing with some actual gender dysphoria, if they're left to themselves, if they're not put on the bandwagon of the transgenderism and moving in that direction, they 85% of the time or higher will come to correlate with their biology. Is that correct?
Yeah, the broadest swath, if you're looking for the extremes of the literature, it says no less than 60%. And in guys, it's up to 98%. Okay. But the 85% number, that's repeated a lot as a pooling. Yeah, if they're just left alone, they will get comfortable with their own body by the time, they are adults, unless it is affirmed. And that is why so much as social affirmation is destructive. And in the UK, this has been put into print. One of those 3 comprehensive literature reviews is the CAS review, and it was just the interim report that came out, resulted ultimately in the closing of the world's largest pediatrics gender clinic, the National Health Service's Gender Identity Development Service at Tavistock and Portman. Closed, and to reopen under a new model with strong emphasis on mental health, neurodevelopmental problems, insisting that the teams that deal with this have experts in all the above. No more of what they call diagnostic overshadowing. Well, what does that mean? That means whatever other diagnoses you had coming into this, autism spectrum disorder, bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety. As soon as someone says gender dysphoria, you're trans, all that stuff was just pushed to the side. That's diagnostic overshadowing, and those problems are still there. And one of the things they noted in their write-up for the new model is, the strong pronouncement that social affirmation is not a benign intervention. It achieves something, and you better think about this. And a lot of other good things that have, come in that. So, the same thing, some of the best studies on this, again, there's decades of literature showing these underlying mental health problems, ACEs, as we call them, adverse childhood experiences, family issues, autism spectrum disorder, shows that they predate the appearance of gender dysphoria. It's not the other way around because of minority stress theory and, because of being stigmatized. The problems were there first. And in the case of rapid onset gender dysphoria, that's where it shows up in the teens and tweens with no antecedent. There was no sign of this before. And I know the other side hates hearing rapid onset gender dysphoria, but it's a reality, and it's by other names. It's been recognized in the literature long before Lisa Littman gave it a name in 2018 or so. That in that particular case, look how often it happens, like when there's divorces happening, a really nasty family dynamics or some family tragedy, and the kid locks onto this false answer. And that, by the way, is what makes kids on autism spectrum disorder, Asperger's right on down, what makes them so vulnerable to this and why they're so overrepresented is, ASD kids or adults have a hard time with abstractions. They lock onto the concrete. And so what happens with coaching from the web, it can happen with coaching from your friend group, but, ASD kids tend not to have so many friends. But they get convinced by the wrong part of the web. Now I know why I'm so different from all my friends. It's because I'm trans. What? It's exactly the wrong answer. But once they've locked onto it, it kind of has, sticking power to it.
Yes. Yeah, very much so. The other thing, when you mentioned Tavistock, so that closed down. And what that reminds me of, though, is you probably have the dates in terms of the years. I forget which year it was that we had only one hospital or one so-called treatment center.
2007, Boston Children's.
Okay. Amazing. 2007, we went from one to now we have over 200, I think, across the country.
You can't count them now because the Planned Parenthood clinics have also become dispensing centers for hormones. So it's not just like, the university centers, there's, over 100 of them. You have to count all the Planned Parenthood clinics.
Well, and you also mentioned the idea, and this is very important, I think, as well, and I think a lot of times as Christians we miss this, that social affirmation is not a benign thing, right? And so one of the things I've been sharing when I'm teaching and preaching and, traveling and doing conferences and such is that, we often, there's three primary stages of transition. There's the social transition, there's the chemical hormonal transition, and there's the surgical transition. And maybe you might have another way of nuancing that, or there's that word again, or clarifying that. But what I oftentimes say to the church is, there are churches that are out of the best of intentions and out of a good motivation actually engaging in social transition. And they're not realizing the power that by going along with using pronouns that are not accurate, using the name thing to me is a little bit more I'm not always sure what to do about the name situation, because in some cases I don't even know what the name is. Right. There are times, right, that if I'm evangelizing or I'm being introduced to somebody, or a new kid shows up at youth group, I don't know what their original name is if they're only telling me what it is now. But when it comes to the pronoun situation, and going along with and accommodating that. I think that there's ways as we as the church and Christians can, and friends, believing friends, can actually engage with somebody in a way that's really loving, really open, but also very clear about, hey, I can do this. I'm not going to go out of my way to call you by a pronoun that you don't like or that you don't like referred to you. I'm not going to just say he over and over again every chance I get, or his, if that's not how you want to be referred to. But I'm also not going. I can't also use a pronoun or a reference to you that's not true or accurate either.
Right.
And so I think there's ways that it feels like, I think in the church, it's like either we're mean and we're truthful, or we're loving and we accommodate things that are not truthful.
I'm thinking, Alexander Solzhenitsyn and the more recent Christian author who titled a book by it, who's actually right next to me, Rod Dreher, right. That's his book. I should have said the book there. Don't live by lies. So someone else can pick their name. That's not my call, but you don't get to pick my pronouns. And respect is a two-way street, So if this relationship is dependent on manipulative and coercive language, we already sort of have a problem. I can respect you and I can show you compassion, even if we strongly disagree. But don't pick my pronouns for me. And that, by the way,
that's what tolerance originally meant, right? That's what you described.
That's what I told a corporate head once who was calling me on the carpet on this. I go, tolerance is a two-way street. That's what it means. Mm-hmm. There's got to be give and take, both ways. And of course, there's so much, emotional blackmail that's coming into this, nationally, internationally, that, if you don't agree with us, it leads to suicide. That's actually not what the literature shows. How dare you say that? And so I'll show you the literature of why I say that, But again, these points have been so reinforced by the other side, so much emotional blackmail, people are afraid to contradict it, But that's what ends up happening when you're speaking reality to a situation, is you'll be falsely accused, and you just need to push through that and demonstrate the good stuff rather than demonstrating the bad stuff that we're being falsely accused of.
Right. Well, and that also brings to mind something that Chloe said in this engagement that we were doing at this conference, and I recall her saying this, and then I've heard this from plenty of others as well, that she doesn't blame her parents for not fighting harder for her to to resist going down this pathway, because one of the reasons is because wherever they turned, it was reinforced over and over again that this is the only thing that is going to help your daughter.
Yeah, we hear
she's
parents
not a girl, she's a boy.
Yeah, we have parents from coast to coast telling us they were told, look, do you want a live son or a dead daughter? Do you want to be planning a transition or a funeral? And of course, gender transition procedures can't begin to deliver on that promise, but they're told it is,
Right. Well, and so the level of manipulation and cruelty, honestly, in that is shocking and in many ways unbelievable. So yes, many parents are getting caught up in this simply because they love their child and they're trying they're listening to the so-called medical or mental health advice that's being given to them, and again, so many times that's, I'm not saying in every case, but in many cases, the mental health of the child is not even being taken into consideration. It's simply, this is like you said, if you say transgender, then everything else is pushed aside. You can't even be curious as a counselor or mental health provider about going down that path and trying to uncover what some of the potential causes could have been, or what some of the underlying issues are. You just have to sweep all that off the table, and now we're only looking at the centerpiece of transgenderism.
And so what we've had is transgenderism is a government-sponsored religion. And I wrote an article on that for public discourse that anybody can access. And a California attorney locked onto that and wrote her own and sent me a thank you on that for getting her started on it. And this is what it is, imposed ideology. And it needs to be recognized as such. And again, the pushback has started, both internationally as well as nationally here. Lawsuits such as Chloe Cole's and Truth in Advertising, I'm working with the attorneys in that case. Likewise, the state of Florida and all they've done to turn what their state was doing around, that their Medicaid division will not be paying for gender transition procedures for minors or adults. I've been contracted to it. I've been assisting them along with other people helping them all through that, so that they were supported by good science, good medicine. This stuff needs to be resisted, and it's gonna come down. But it's just the sooner the better, because every day some kids getting chemically sterilized or surgically mutilated. Yes. So the sooner this ends, the better. And it's, as Professor Paul McHugh of Hopkins, who brought this down when it was happening, in the last century, he said this is going to come down when the kids and the families that have come through this come out on the other end, when they turn around and they don't just sue the doctors and the hospitals, but the pharmaceutical firms and the insurance companies. That's when this is going to stop. And that's what's starting to happen now. I'm very pleased to say, it's the early stages of it, but there's, malpractice cases across the board. And the thing with the Chloe Cole case, since it's the Kaiser hospital chain, well, that's an HMO. So it's a hospital that is a chain that is an insurance company. So it's an extremely significant case. So we're hoping it's going to be America's Bell versus Tavistock, which was the big case in the UK that helped get things rolling. Yes. But, the insurance companies, the pharmaceutical firms, the hospital chains, all those who stood to profit from this. And you profit big, because when you medicalize somebody, they're medicalized for the rest of their life. And they're needing stuff that they would never be using otherwise forever. And then other stuff for the complications. And if they engage in surgeries, that, very often leads to complications leading to more surgeries and so on and so forth. So now they're going to get to pay the other way around. Now you're going to, these people that you encourage to get chemically sterilized, surgically mutilated, how about you get to pay for their medical care? And yes, the insurance will cover it. It won't be an uncovered problem, And look at this on a different subject, same result. State of California, North Carolina, I understand Virginia, starting with North Carolina in 2012, and California was the most recent in 2021, passing laws that any surviving individual who is subject to government forced sterilization because of the eugenics movement, which California played a big part in. The state's going to pay you for your suffering. The states are going to get to do it again. All these states that have encouraged kids and adults to railroading them, as I told several legislators in California, railroading them to down this path to nowhere. It doesn't address the problems. It doesn't change anything, except now you've made the person sterile and butchered them up.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I love the folks that I know who embraced, who went down this road, who were confused, who went along with the so-called advice of those who led them astray, and went did top surgery, bottom surgery, and hormone therapy or whatever, all that. And by the way, none of these drugs, speak to this for a moment, none of these drugs that are being used are actually FDA approved for this purpose, right? These are all off label, correct? That's right.
Using gonadotropin releasing hormone agonists, puberty blockers for gender dysphoria is not FDA approved. It's only approved for precocious puberty, where you've actually got a disease state that you're interfering with for a few years until the proper age kicks in, or for prostate cancer, that kind of thing. Cross-sex hormones, interestingly, there was a 2014 national review, but more importantly, a 2019 international review. Different endocrine societies from around the world asked to look at the literature and, hey, what does the literature say about testosterone use in women? And both came to the same conclusion, that there is absolutely no indication for testosterone in women except short-term use for hypoactive sexual desire disorder. And that's it. And the 2019 one specified there's no exception, not for disease prevention, not for wellness, and they added the long-term consequences of testosterone in women has not been adequately studied. And that study didn't say one word about gender dysphoria. It's like, oh, there's cowardice. You know what you had to say in that study. You know what you had to say, and you avoided saying it.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit with you about the way that studies and samples and, all the data that goes into outcomes and the analysis can be so flawed and so twisted. I mean, we hence the adage that you can really use the numbers for anything.
Yeah.
But I'd love for you to speak to that a little bit. But before we get to that, I'm also reminded of a law that just recently passed in California that Governor Newsom signed into law, a bill 665, I believe it is. I think they got it off by a digit. But Bill 665 has to do with children, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, possibly being able to be taken away from their parents who don't affirm gender dysphoria, which also opens up then, and maybe I'm conflating two different bills, but also opens up that California essentially is a sanctuary state for underage kids to come to. If they can get away from their parents, they can come and essentially be emancipated if they identify as trans and they want to go down this pathway toward pursuing intervention. Can you speak to those issues a little bit as far as California?
Bills on trans items and whatever in California that have been passed over the last, several years. And it is hard to keep them straight. And there's different ones that keep building on the other. But yeah, California is a sanctuary state for abortion and for transing. Some have called the transing part of that the child kidnapping bill because of how it would affect, for example, custody cases in other states or whatnot, where you have competing parents and all the kid has to do is arrive here. And now suddenly he's competent to make, or she is competent to make decisions they can't make. Kids don't have the intellectual wherewithal to make informed consent decisions on this kind of thing. They can't get a tattoo, without parental permission, but they can, have this happen. There's other stuff, that wasn't signed into law. But, some of these kind of things were. I think they're not going to hold up well in court. Several other things have actually been struck down in court on some different components of things. But yeah, California just keeps shoveling this stuff out, faster than people can react to it.
Yeah. Yep. Well, speak to the some of the studies that have been done that, for example, I think of a study that was done that is indicating that people who experience counseling and so-called conversion therapy, talk therapy, are more apt to commit suicide after that. And again, correct the language that I'm using if it's off or wrong. But I know that there is a study that was indicating that, oh no, there's serious issues that you steer clear of so-called conversion therapy, again, talk therapy, for these issues because people are committing suicide once they get into these talk therapy sessions on this topic. Can you clear that up?
Yeah, first, taking back the language, conversion therapy is a pejorative, vague jamming tactic since its first appearance in the professional literature in 1991 when an activist gay psychologist put it in there. So it's whatever people say it is, of course, and it's presented as horrible. Frankly, in the modern world, there is no such thing. What we're talking about is simple talk therapy with a willing and motivated client who's the person who brings it up, right? But you're talking most recently, I believe, of the Blosnich study, which looked at a body of data that's publicly available from the Williams Institute called the Generation Study. And it said, we all know that, gay identified people have much more adverse childhood experiences and traumas. It's like, I'm glad to see you admit that because half the time we bring it up and you call us bigots. But they went on to say, and one of those is conversion therapy, which increases the chance of suicide. Well, psychologist colleague of mine roped me and a couple of other people into looking at this. I was actually the only non-scholar amongst them. The other three were all professors, right? And said, look at the mistakes this guy made, So submitted a letter to the editor that, he got published. I was one of the co-signatures. In that same journal, the first take on it was, well, first of all, you're making the same mistake that's repeatedly made in these, conversion therapy is evil studies, that you didn't look at the before and after. You're looking at a lifetime association. People who had conversion therapy had worse mental health and more suicide attempts. Well, the question is, was that before the therapy or after? I mean, looking at something else the same way, you could say, coronary artery bypass grafting's got to be banned because more people who have that have heart conditions. And, whoa, yeah, that's why they had it. Or you have to do away with antidepressants because, more people are associated with suicidality that have been on antidepressants. Well, yeah, okay, but before or after the medicine, right? So Professor Paul Sullins got the raw data. Again, it's publicly available, the generation study. And looking at it, he found it had always had the data in there of before and after. Nobody that's written a study on it had ever looked on it before him, and found twofold. The people with worse mental health were the more likely ones to go for sexual orientation change efforts. Obviously, you're worse off, you're more likely to look for help, right? And then experienced an extraordinary drop in suicidality. And some of the indicators of suicidality, because it comes in different forms, thoughts, intentions, whatnot, or actual actions, it went down 17 to 25 times. Exactly the opposite of what Blazhnitz
times,
claims.
Not percent.
Yeah.
Yes.
And of course, Blazhnitz and the team didn't like any of this being heard and published. And of course, poof, one letter to the editors saying, this should be retracted because it's bad. It's like, well, there's science on high. You didn't like what was said, so you're trying to cancel it. But yeah, that's one example of what you were talking about. And we have several studies out just in the past 2 to 3 years, actually showing people going through therapy. And this is longitudinal. They're following around. It's not the usual retrospective stuff.
Yes.
Showing that they generally were helped. And even for those for whom, and this was another study Sullins did, even for those for whom therapy was a complete failure, they had an improving of mental health. They came to peace with things. The therapy was a help, not torture, didn't lead them to suicide, just the opposite of what we're told. But that's a sacred cow that's going to die kind of hard.
Yeah. Well, once the messaging gets out there, and this is the reason behind it, right? Once it's out there and it's blasted out on the airwaves and through media that also has a bent and seems to have an ideology that completely agrees with these perspectives, it's very hard to you can retract it, but it's very hard to actually, you can't get the horse back in the barn. Basically, people wind up believing that, oh no, wow, this study came out that says that therapy actually causes harm, and people are committing suicide as a result of it. And so now, wow, as Christians that are supposed to be compassionate, what do we do about that? And so there's just so much confusion out there. Another one that another thing that I've heard is that when I was reading through Ryan T. Anderson's book, When Harry Became Sally, that's such an excellent book that Amazon banned. One of the statements, one of the studies he refers to was that those who are post-surgery for, again, transgenderism, those after surgery, they're still transgender folks are still 19 times more likely to commit suicide than the average population. Do you know which study he was referring to there?
Sure do. We quote that one very often. 2011 out of Sweden. The author's last name, Dhejne. I don't know how to pronounce that in Swedish. They looked, it was a study over 30 years, looking at the medical records and all that, of all 324 people who had undergone transition in Sweden. So selection bias of 0, they included everybody, and found that if you follow them not 6 months, not a year or two like most of these studies do and claim victory, you follow them 10 years out or more, at that point, they have, like you said, 19 times the completed suicide rate of the general population. They didn't try, they did. About 3 times the all-cause mortality, meaning all the things that can kill someone, and about 3 times the rate of psychiatric hospitalization. Well, that's not sounding great, Now, again...
That doesn't sound very loving, actually.
No. And again, that 2020 study now by Brandstrom and Pachankis that ultimately showed, again, in Sweden, looking at all 9.7 million people in the records and stuff, that neither what they call gender-affirming hormones nor gender-affirming surgery improved any of the mental health benchmarks they were looking at. And another very interesting study, just 2021, comprehensive study looking at the 3,700 trans-identified adolescents in U.S. military families. And they looked over 8.5 years. And they found that gender hormone treatment led to an increased use of the mental health services, pediatric medical services, increased suicidal ideation, increased suicide attempt. It's not helping things. It's a dodge.
Yes. Yep. Are there any others? We come toward the end of the podcast for those that are listening or watching. Are there any other particular studies or points that maybe some newer, maybe some older, but some things that we haven't hit on yet that you feel would be helpful for people to know about? I know you have a lot of information out there, and I'd love for you to share in a moment how people can follow you and read some of the reports you've written or some of the articles that you put out. But are there any other pieces that you feel like should be mentioned here before we close out our podcast?
There's common flaws, to the studies saying, pro-transing. And as pointed out by my colleague, Associate Professor of Pediatric Endocrinology, Paul Hrues, he wrote, limitations of the existing transgender literature include general lack of randomized prospective design. They're usually retrospective, cross-sectional, small sample sizes, recruitment bias, which can be extraordinary, short study duration, way high subject dropout rates, and a reliance on so-called expert opinion. And the dropout rate is commonly 20 to 60% in these studies. If this was talking about a pharmaceutical trial, it would be invalid at that point, So something to keep in mind there. So some bad studies. Anything based on the U.S. Transgender Survey of 2015, don't bother. I mean, the study was an online survey of transgender identified and gender queer adults from trans-affirming websites. So that's as biased as you can get, by design.
Right.
It includes everybody who doesn't identify that way anymore or is dead or, can't reply. So it's non-representative. It didn't even ask a specific question about gender dysphoria, just about identification. So that makes things confusing. It didn't control for underlying mental health. And get this, 70% of the respondents in the U.S. Transgender Survey didn't know what puberty blockers were. Well, how do we know that? Because they claimed that they began it after age 18. Well, as far as puberty, the horse is way out of the barn by 18. Blocking's not going to help you then. So stuff by Jack Turbin that usually relies on the U.S. Transgender Survey. His studies have been roundly defeated, and yet they're quoted right and left, and he's a media darling. Trevor, the Trevor Group, out of North Carolina and where else they're headquartered, Trevor Foundation. They use studies by Green that both severely flawed. The 2021 study, Association of Gender-Affirming Hormone Therapy with Different Aspects of Mental Health. Again, retrospective, cross-sectional, so you can't determine causation, because of it. It even says so. And by the way, this is something Jack Turbin and the other people do. You look at the limitations section of the paper, they'll say, you can't infer causality by cross-sectional design. And then they do it. It's even in the title of the paper,
Yep.
They ignored key variables on the Green study. They didn't look at substance abuse, bad childhood experiences, which is common in this group. It was done during the COVID pandemic, and they didn't make any accounting for the negative mental health effects of the pandemic and the lockdown. And also someone who's genuinely suicidal is not going to be reporting to surveys. And the results of the thing, 44% of those who received hormones, 57% of who wanted and did not receive, reported seriously considering suicide. Well, that's a failure. 44% of the ones who got the hormones still were suicidal, right? 60% of those receiving the hormone, 75% who wanted to and didn't, reported recent depression. That's, again, a failure. But again, they twist it and declare success. I think one of the most outrageous is Olson Kennedy's out of Children's Hospital, Los Angeles, 2018, on mastectomies on minors. The title Chest Dysphoria was, the questionable claim was chest dysphoria was high among pre-surgical transmasculine youth. Again, see the weaponized language. And surgical intervention positively effective. Well, here's the thing. Chest dysphoria is a neologism. See, invented the term. That's not a DSM-5 diagnosis. Then their chest dysphoria scale, they also invented. And at least they had the graciousness to say, quote, it's not yet validated. Well, it never will be. They made it up. And the mastectomies were done on girls as young as 13. And, we have trans activists telling us this is a lie. We don't do surgeries on minors. Well, really? It's in the published literature and they're bragging about it. So, bad news on this stuff. Again, I'm pleased to be working with organizations fighting this, be it law firms, legislators, groups like CMDA, ACPEDS, Alliance Defending Freedom, and there's others out there. And again, it's a team effort. We have going small team. There's really few people with MD after their names that are willing to speak up on this, but
right.
Good things happening. So anybody you were mentioning, stuff that I write, Christian Medical and Dental Association, cmda.org, and just put my name in the search engine and it'll lead you to my blogs there. The Public Discourse, Ryan Anderson is the editor for them, and I've written several things from them that are still up too. That's an easy way to do it.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Well, and to wrap up, I feel like something I say quite a bit when I'm speaking and teaching at churches is that we need to, as Christians, we need to be able to learn how to separate ideology from individuals. And we don't do that well. No. We tend to lump people who are hurting and broken and may come across as, I think many people in the LGBT community assume that the church hates them because they've been told over and over again. Some have had experiences of that. There are some churches that have been very hateful or very unkind to some, and so either they've experienced some of that personally from a bad experiences of those who supposedly represent Christ and frankly don't. Or they know of others who have. And so there's this generalized sense that Christians hate them. And so when we're, as Christians, as the church, when we are talking with those from that community, those who identify as LGBTQ, there can be a real brashness. There can be a lot of anger kind of coming at us. And I think a lot of that, we're not recognizing that a lot of that is a defense of what they're expecting to be coming at them. Okay. And also as Christians, if we are recognizing like this, the horrendous stuff that's being dumped on children, the things that you and I have talked about, the things that you've unpacked and explained, we need to actually not just stick our heads in the sand, but we need to rise up and be part of the solution in love and graciousness, but with clarity and firmness as well. And so we're pushing it back against an ideology. We're pushing against policies that want to further encroach on religious freedom, on freedom of speech, that kind of thing. But frankly, it really undermines the well-being overall of the whole person, of adults and young people. So we can stand against that, and we should find creative ways of getting involved, whether it's running for school boards, whether it's picking up some other, becoming part of the solution, again, of standing against those things, and not just standing against, but also driving back and seeing policy enacted that actually protects kids and actually produces and helps promote, doesn't produce, but helps promote the environment in which human thriving can best happen. We need to be able to do that while at the same time being really gracious and truthful, but gracious and loving toward people who are confused and under the spell of, under the delusion, under the siren song of culture that's so off base. Yeah. And so many times we lump all of that together. We don't love people very well, or we don't stand up against an ideology because we're so quote unquote compassionate and merciful that we're not doing, I think our jobs as men and women of loving in the best way possible. Yeah. The true biblical love is to desire the best for someone. And that best, I'm so grateful that when I look back, and I wanted my parents to move in my direction when I was, when I brought a couple of boyfriends around and, at different times. And I so wanted them to begin to maybe not affirm, I didn't think that was going to happen, but at least soften their position. Yeah. They never treated me badly when it came to this. They never threw me out of the house. But I'm so grateful looking back in ways I can't even explain, that my parents didn't give me what I wanted at the time. They loved me too much to do that. Yeah. And I think that so many times we as Christians are so sloppy about our so-called love or about grace that we're not loving well, and we're not loving biblically. Yeah. So
3 little maxims come to mind that I put at the end of a lot of my lectures. One from journalist Mark Stein: the future belongs to those who show up. It sounds silly, but man, it's spot on, for good or for bad. Second, from a church mate of mine, Havilah Cunnington: you win by outlasting the crowd. Doesn't matter how smart everybody was. It doesn't matter if you're all bloody, battered, muddy. last person standing is last person standing. Yep. You outlast the crowd. And third is from Pastor Ade Amuba, who I believe is knighted in the UK. And he said, to stand is to win. Simply making the stand. You don't want it to be belligerent, nasty, and all that stuff. You can be kind and gentle when you're speaking reality. It can be done in relatively few words. You don't have to be an MD, a PhD to be doing this. And I think most of the people making the difference, aren't. It's people making a stand, like, teenager Chloe Cole. I mean, goodness sakes, like you were saying.
Yes, absolutely. And those three maxims remind me of one that I read years ago out of a book, and it was simply stating that referring to moms and dads, family, and the church, basically, comparing that to the LGBT community. Essentially, what this said is the ones who loved best win. And meaning that not giving everybody what they're asking for, but the ones who genuinely love, who stay in the game, who show up, who continue to stand and offer that genuine love in the end, that is going to be the most compelling thing. That is the best way. There's no absolute promise on that, but that is a principle that when we love biblically, we love well, we love lavishly, we love truthfully. And when we take truth out of love, it's no longer love. But when we love truthfully, that is the best opportunity for us to have an influence in the life of those that God has called us to minister to and those that we love. So, Andre, so great to have you here, Dr. Van Mol. I so appreciate you taking the time to be with us, and I know our audience does as well. So, for those of you who have joined us either through Love and Truth Network or through Transforming Congregations, we're so glad that you did. I'm glad that you're following us. I hope if this is a first time for you, I just want to invite you to tune in to another episode of our Love and Truth Network podcast. So blessings to you. And again, Dr. Van Mol, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you much.
Thank you so much for joining us for this Love and Truth Network podcast. To listen to or watch future episodes, please check us out at loveandtruth.com/podcast. Also, you can subscribe to Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Google Podcast, and we look forward to seeing you in a future episode.